And I think one of the hardest areas for us to trust God in is the idea that He's in control, that His timing, His plan is the best way to rule the universe, or more specifically, to rule our lives. And that is a history in the human heart that we all struggle with, and the Bible characters throughout history have struggled with that. As we're studying through the book of Esther, let me remind you a little bit of the history of human beings' inability to trust God. This is the whole back half of the Old Testament. And let me tell you a little about Saul. Interesting about Saul is that Saul allowed jealousy to control his life rather than God. God tells him to wait before giving a sacrifice. He doesn't, because he knows better the timing. And then God gives him a second mission and says, I want you to destroy the Amalekites and King Agag. It's going to be important here. And he goes, no, I think I'd rather take the money and not kill off King Agag, despite the terrorist things he's done, despite the horrible things that he's done. I think I'll let him live. And God says, you think you know better than me. I want you to trust that I've got some reasons in the future, we'll talk about today, as to why I need you to do this. This was a villain. This was a criminal. But he doesn't do it. And by demanding control, he will lose control of his life. He'll lose relationships in his life with his son, his daughter, his son-in-law. David will do the same thing. Instead of repenting of his sin, he'll try and manage his sin and control his sin, and he loses control. Ends up killing off a man in his command, a very faithful man. He ends up losing control of his family and a mutiny under Absalom. He has a son named Solomon who becomes such a tyrannical leader that when his son Rehoboam, the kingdom gets divided between the northern kingdom and southern kingdom, they will try and rejoin the empire, and Jeroboam will turn to Rehoboam and say, hey, will you stop acting like dad and trying to control everybody and being so tyrannical? Will you please give us some of our freedom back? And Solomon's son gives a speech that sounds like this. My dad whipped you with whips, and I will whip you with scorpions. And that doesn't go over well, as you can imagine. The place continues to be divided for the rest of the Old Testament because of somebody who demanded control and lost control of the kingdom. The Assyrians conquer the northern kingdom. The Babylonians, under Nebuchadnezzar, conquer both the Assyrians and the southern kingdom, God putting His people back together again because He is the one in control, even on the grand stage. Nebuchadnezzar will think he's in control of everything, and God will appear to him through a gigantic hand and say, we have weighed your kingdom, I have weighed your leadership, and you have been found wanting. And I, the kingdom of heaven, am going to remove you and put somebody else in control. And sure enough, the Persians come and conquer the Babylonians. That was during a time of Cyrus the Great. He allows the people to return to their homeland under Ezra and Nehemiah. But many people do not obey. So the characters in the book of Esther, Mordecai and Esther, are those who did not obey God to return to the land. And now Xerxes has come to power in Persia, and a right-hand man named Haman, an Agagite, meaning the Agagite who's about to produce a genocide to the Hebrew people in the book of Esther, is because Saul didn't so many years ago destroy King Agag because he didn't trust God. And all that comes together today with this principle. Demanding control always leads to losing control until you finally discover who's really in control of the universe. It's not your jealousy. It's not your need for control. It's not your power. It's not your might. It's the Father of heaven. And with that, we're going to look at four crazy controllers and four crazy controlling factors that control your and my life as well in chapter 2 and 3. And my hope is that we can find the one thing that is secure. That's God's grace and presence. The one thing we can root our life in, our value in, when everything else in life seems uncertain, doesn't seem to be going the way it ought to or the way we want it to. The one thing we can root in our identity is that God is in control, and He is where we get anchored to in the midst of uncertainty and insecurity. Our first crazy control comes from Xerxes. We're in chapter 2 of Esther, and it begins by saying, after these things. Now, if we remember last week, King Xerxes has paraded for 180 days his power and might. He's paraded before everybody. It took 180 days to parade how much power he had. Had 180 days to parade how much riches he had. And he's trying to basically get all of his soldiers and all of his commanders to be so impressed with how powerful and rich he is that they will help him go and defeat the Greeks. Because as much as he's in control of the known world, he feels like he's not really in control until he defeats the Greeks. And this phrase, after these things, if we look at what happened in chapter 1 and chapter 2, it's been 4 years. 4 years since he lost his wife and banished her for standing up to him. 4 years, and during those 4 years, history tells us, the king Ahasuerus, Persian name Xerxes, did go to battle with the Greeks, and he gets obliterated. He gets embarrassingly humiliated. And now he's sitting in a pool of defeat. His greatest thing has fallen apart. He's lost the one woman who truly cared about him, Vashti. And it's after these things the wrath of the king subsided. That's a 4-year grudge. And then he remembered Vashti, the one woman who treated him like an equal, the one woman he loved and loved him, who loved him enough to say, no, I'm not going to dance with only my crown before your drunken brawl. He remembers what she has done and what had been decreed against her. He felt regret. And I think the principle or philosophy of Xerxes' life could be summed up in this phrase. By demanding control, I lost control. By demanding control, I lost control of the army, and I lost because I had such blind spots. By demanding control in my relationship with my wife, I lost someone I really cared about. By demanding control, I ended up with a lot of regret because drunkenness controlled me, my anger controlled me, my need to parade everything I'd done had controlled me. And just that moment, he probably should have taken some time to reflect. And why do I keep hurting the people I care about? Why do I keep making decisions that end up bringing pain into my life? Why in my need for control do I end up losing control? But instead of taking a few moments of reflection to discover who might really be in control of the universe, he instead swaps control for medicating it. In fact, historians tell us that he is so depressed, he is so discouraged from this loss from Greece, he offers a reward for anyone who can invent a new type of sensuality. Somebody to medicate this pain. He's got a harem of hundreds of women. He needs some new way to medicate this disappointment in his life. And the king's servants see him there in that pool and we got to fix this. So they say, you know what we need? Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. I got an idea, a new reality show. It's called Bachelor Persia. That's what he needs. And that's what they do. Let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of the kingdom so that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins, the Shushan, the citadel, into the women's quarters, under the custodian of Haggai, the king's eunuch, custodian of the women. And let beauty preparations be given them. And let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. And here we have a man who seemingly is in control of the world, and yet in his anger, in his quest for power, in his embarrassment that she would not do what he said when he was in a drunken situation, he banished the queen. And now in his regret, instead of taking time to reflect on who really controls the board, he instead decides to medicate. He basically just switched. This phrase, instead of, is very good, because instead of control, he's going to switch to sensuality. But he's not really dealing with what's broken in his own heart. And as he does this, he's lost the woman he cared about. And God is going to use his anger, Vashti's inability, her boundary in setting up a tough call and a tough haul. And God is going to use his anger, his drunkenness, her decision to set the stage for something that goes back even to the time of King Saul. How will God rescue his people from genocide, from Haman? And these two little pawns on the board, Mordecai and Esther, who also are not perfect. They did not obey God going back with Ezra and Nehemiah. God will use their rebellion and their disobedience to set the stage, to move Esther down the board, to become the next queen in the kingdom. And what's amazing is that God is thinking 12 steps ahead. This is the one book of the Bible that God's name is never mentioned, and yet you see him coordinating coincidences over coincidences to put all the pieces together. And that's what he does. God is in control when it looks like he's not even on the board. It's Xerxes' regret. When you demand control, you lose control. Our second character is Mordecai. Mordecai's crazy fear. Fear is what controls him. And if you were to give a motto to his life, it would be, when I look at the board of my life, if no one's in control, then my life's out of control. And honestly, Mordecai would have good reasons to tell you why he and Esther feel out of control. The Bible tells us exactly what my map showed us, which is that in Shushan the citadel there was a certain Jew, and his name was Mordecai. And he had been carried away from Jerusalem. He had lost his hometown. He had lost his home temple. He had been ripped from his homeland and deposited into Babylon. It mentions that here. With the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah, the king of Judah. Remember I told you the kingdom was divided? Who Nebuchadnezzar took away to Babylon, and then Babylon got conquered by the Persians. I mean, these folks have seen a lot of transition. A lot of horrible things have happened. And their life has felt very, very out of control. Like nations are changing, kingdoms are changing, administrations are changing, and they have been seemingly victims of it. And Mordecai brought up Hadassah, the Hebrew name of Esther, Hadassah, which means hidden. That is Esther, his uncle's daughter, their cousins. For she had, and Esther would also say, her life feels very out of control, because if God was really in control, maybe I would not have lost my mother and father. She's an orphan, taken in by her cousin. But Esther decides not to reveal her people or her family when she enters into this contest. For Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. I don't think it's wise to reveal that information, and she trusted him. And every day, Mordecai paced back and forth in front of the court of the women's to learn of Esther's welfare. What was happening to her? So what's interesting is that even Mordecai, who will stand up to Haman and say, I can't bow down before you, the same Haman that is all-powerful and threatens him, the same Mordecai who's able to stand up against his own fear against Haman, we see pacing back and forth. So as much trust as he has that he will tell Esther, risk your life. God may have placed you here for such a time as this. That's a lot of courage. That's a lot of confidence. And yet, even in an imperfect world, we find him pacing, God, are you really in control? What's really going on here? You see, if God's not really in control of the world, our careers, our life, and our details, we end up trying to take control of our own fears. We become perfectionists, we become control freaks, we become worriers. All these are ways in which we try and control or manage our own fear, when God says, instead, I want you to put your trust in me when you have those feelings. Our friends started into Bible study for the first time here at Horizon. And they said, one of the things I've learned in my Bible study is I've always been a worrier. And now, when those worries come to my mind, they still do, I try and turn them into prayers. And saying, God, I'm trusting you to handle this. I need you to handle this. And my faith is growing as I stop controlling things through worry and instead trying to hand things over through prayer. I talked to somebody this week who was really having issues with revenge. And specifically, they were fearful that this person who had committed injustice against them was going to get away with it. And they were fearful that people were going to believe the lies that were being told by this person to sort of package what they were doing. I said, honestly, you can't control that. There's a great verse in 1 Peter I mentioned that's helped me in these situations. It says that when he was reviled, he did not revile in return, but instead Jesus entrusted himself to him who judges righteously. I said, your fear of them getting away with it, your fear of them tricking everybody else, the only way to manage that is to realize God's in control and he will bring about ultimate justice, and to entrust the situation, to entrust what's going on here to God. So I want to try that. I said, I'd memorize that verse, and every time these feelings of fear come up, and hand it back over to God. Our third character is Esther. If you have a motto for her life, it would be, I find control by being in control. It's a very startling passage here at verse 8. So it was that when the king's command and decree were heard about this beauty contest, that many, many young women were gathered at Shushan the citadel under the custody of Hegai, And Esther was taken. Notice the verb tense here. It's passive. As if Esther didn't have a choice. She was gathered. She was taken. And so here was Esther, seemingly now carried away or taken into the king's court with many, many other women. And as she is taken there, commentators and rabbis and Jewish scholars over the years don't know what to do with this. She might be a victim of basically a sex trade industry. In Persia, you don't have a choice. She was gathered together. She was taken. And for a year, she's given basically beauty treatments and pampering from the Persian Empire. In fact, rabbis tried, and even Protestants tried, to take this book out of the Bible. It was so offensive. She's basically getting the equivalent of Persian Kama Sutra training during this year to prepare for her one night with the king. And she's either a victim of a horrific capturing of her as a victim of the sex trade industry of Persia, or she's someone who saw an opportunity to use her sensuality to get something out of it. In other words, hey, if I'm going to be trained to play in this Bachelor Persia, I'm not just going to play, I'm going to win. I'm not a victim here. I'm going to gain control of the situation by trying to seduce the king. And I'm going to be the better one in bed with him than any other woman he sees. And that is ultimately what happens, is that she seduces the king, he is pleased by her with her one night, and he showers her with gifts. But because the New Testament not once references the book of Esther, we don't have any commentary on the New Testament to help us know what happened here. Was she a victim, or was she a player? In contrast to Daniel, Shadrach, and Meshach, and Abednego, they came into Nebuchadnezzar and they said, listen, I got to tell you, we got some standards of things we do and don't do. We don't eat this thing. We don't do that. We want to be honorable. We want to be respectful. But we got some convictions. And rabbis have always seen the difference between Esther, who seemingly compromised the whole way up, to Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who took a strong stand. But here's the amazing thing about the book of Esther. Whatever the situation is, God will work in this situation. God will work in her life. And she will move from someone who compromised her convictions to ultimately someone God uses and turns into a brave heart to stand up for himself and his people. Because the book of Esther is how God uses broken people in broken times to do extraordinary things. Now, she does get rewarded. The young woman pleased him, and she obtained his favor. So he, the king, readily gave her beauty preparations besides her allowance. The 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace. He moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the women. And Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had told her not to do it. So he's now, you see why he's pacing back and forth? This is your daughter. Wouldn't you be concerned what was going on in the kingdom? And does it feel like God's in control of the board at all? Look at chapter 1 and chapter 2. In chapter 1, you have a king who is parading his power and money before everybody for 180 days. And now in chapter 2, a culture that parades, you're only worth as much as how good you look. Can you imagine living in a culture that was all about parading money and beauty? Yes. Imagine that. That you defined your value by your money and your power and how you looked, or your ability to control others with your looks. And here's what's amazing, is that it's into this situation that God's name has never been mentioned yet. And here's why. God is so secure in who He is. God is so secure in what He's doing, thinking 12 moves ahead. God doesn't need to brag. God doesn't need to parade. There is another king who's 12 moves ahead. He doesn't have to make a big deal. He can quietly and strategically work behind the scenes. He is so secure in His plans. Hadassah, hidden. God's strategies are hidden because He is already at work. Mordecai, whose cousin is the king, will be the exact same one who will stand up to Haman. And he will be the exact same one in this chapter who rescues the king's life by discovering an attempt to murder the king. All of it behind the scenes, all of it quiet, because there is a King of Kings and Lord of Lords. There is one who is in control, and even though he doesn't need to parade and brag about what he's doing in this whole book, he says you can be secure in knowing that if you are rooting yourself not in your fears, not in your attraction, not in your regrets, but if you will put your security in me, you can trust that even when I'm hidden and even when I'm silent, I am controlling the board to create and accomplish my purposes. Our last character is Haman. Haman's crazy anger. This is a man who is controlled by anger, controlled by wrath, controlled by his need to be recognized for who he is. If you had a motto for his life, it would be, I lose control when other people don't know I'm in control. If you have to tell people you're in control, you're not. You have to tell people you're important, you're not. You have to tell people you're in charge, you're not. And this is what we see coming out of Haman. He has got such a need to find his identity in things outside of himself, things beyond his control. He is always filled with an uncontrollable wrath and anger. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hamdatha the Agagite. Which means if Saul had trusted God so many years ago, God was basically saying, in this battle, you're coming face to face with what's going to be the descendant of a up-and-coming Hitler many years from now. Please obey me. He's done horrible, horrific things now. He's going to do horrible, horrific things later. Destroy King Agag. Saul says, I know better than God. He doesn't do it. And here we are in the book of Esther, where the descendants of Agag are again trying to destroy the Hebrews. Another interesting thing is that Saul was a Benjamite and Esther's a Benjamite. So here in Esther, we are replaying a Benjamite against an Agagite. And this time we'll find one that will be faithful versus faithless. So Haman, the son of Hamdatha the Agagite, and advanced him and set him above all the princes who were with him. And all the king's servants who were with him at the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman. So the king had commanded concerning him. Everybody needs to bow down to Haman. But Mordecai would not bow or pay homage to him. What is he thinking? This guy either knows something we don't, or he is got a really bad plan. Because he's coming up against the king's second command, a narcissist, a power-hungry, insecure, revenge-filled commander. And here this little bitty pawn of Mordecai refuses to bow down and pay homage to him. Either he has no idea what he's doing, or he has got his identity and his decision-making rooted in something way outside of the kingdom of Persia. See, when you root your identity in something secure, you can stand up in a kingdom that's obsessed with money and power and might and titles and position, because your life isn't defined by those things. And Mordecai is able to not bow down or pay homage. Now, the king's servants know he's a foreigner, and they're going to try and plead with him. Maybe he doesn't understand the protocol. The king's servants who were with him said to Mordecai, why do you transgress the king's command? Do you not understand how important this is? Now, it happened that when they spoke to him daily, they're begging him daily, come on, you got to do this. You got to bow down. He would not listen to them, and they eventually got to tell Haman, that little Jewish man, Mordecai, won't bow down to you. To see whether or not Mordecai's words would stand. In the same way Vashti stood up to King Xerxes, here in chapter 2, Mordecai is standing up to Haman. For Mordecai had told them he was a Jew. And again, you get the sense that daily when they're asking him, he says, listen, I'm not trying to be offensive. I'm not trying to disrespect. This is just between me and God. And as a Jewish man, I believe that God is the only one who's king that I bow down to. And so I don't bow down to other kings. And this is the same guy who saved the king's life. And it's interesting, as a Christian, sometimes we can be so obnoxious, or we can so compromise. And here in Haman, we see a unique ability to be honorable to the king, to be honorable to the kingdom that he doesn't agree with, to even save the life of the king he doesn't agree with. And yet he also has times he has to say, listen, I can't go farther than this. In a world where Christians can either be obnoxious or compromising, Mordecai shows us another way. That he's willing to serve the king in whatever way he can, while at the same time set standards of things he can't. Now when Haman saw that this little Mordecai did not bow down or pay him homage, Haman was filled with wrath. And that's the problem with when you find your identity with something outside of you. You get filled with an uncontrollable rage. See, the Bible, God's angry often. He even tells us that we can be angry. But there's a difference between an appropriate anger, a proportional anger, this addresses this situation, or this is going to help in this situation kind of anger, versus this uncontrollable anger. God never has uncontrollable anger. And anytime you have uncontrollable anger, it's not the fruit of the Spirit. Because God's never out of control. And so if you find yourself in situations of uncontrollable anger, that's a time to say, God, why am I so angry at you or this person or my kids here? It's always because we found our identity in something outside of ourselves. Basically, Haman says, unless you agree with me, I'm going to destroy you. Unless I'm right. See, we all like being right. We all sometimes are right. But when you put your identity in being right and somebody disagrees with you and you find that uncontrollable anger coming out of you, that's a sign that you put your identity in needing to be right. We all like to be recognized. But when you put your identity in being recognized, then all of a sudden if somebody like a little Mordecai doesn't recognize you for what you've done, you have uncontrollable anger. Uncontrollable need for recognition. And suddenly, we have 4 different emotions or factors that can control our life. Are we controlled by regret, like the king? Are we controlled by wrath, like Haman? Are we controlled by our need to be attractive or to attract other people, like Esther did? Or are we controlled by fear, like Mordecai was? I think whenever we don't root our identity in the grace and confidence in God, we end up trying to build our identity in something else. And it always ends up in fear. It always ends up in regret. It always ends up in losing control when other people don't know we're in control. And God would say, that's why I want you to discover who's really in control. Because if I'm really in control of your life, you can trust me. Whatever situation you're in, whatever forces that are working around you, you can trust me that I am working in a hidden way in the midst of the quiet. So that's why I want to end the service today by giving some practical advice on how to deal with a crazy world and crazy people. Because we're all going to have Esthers in our life, Esther moments. We have to stand up to Xerxes. We're going to have Vashti moments in our life. We're going to have Haman moments in our life. So I want to give you 3 principles I think come out of this text and some books that I've found very helpful in my life on how to deal with difficult people. Number 1, I think this text tells us that you realize that difficult people are actually insecure people. It's a great book by Henry Cloud and Dr. Townsend called Boundaries. A book called Boundaries, and it's Boundaries of Marriage, Boundaries of Kids. It's a great book on how to set appropriate, loving, not reactionary boundaries, and how to do it in a loving way in your life. So when you come face to face with difficult people, you need to realize that these are actually insecure people. So King Xerxes doesn't look insecure. He looks like he's controlling the whole world. But he's so insecure because he's defined by something that's unstable. If only I could defeat the Greeks, then I'd be happy. If only people could recognize me, I'd be happy. If only I could tell my wife to dance before me with a crown, then I'd be happy. One woman, Vashti, standing up to the king, and all of a sudden this secure kingdom huddles together and creates decrees about how no women can ever speak up against her husband. And so this secure person, the secure kingdom, is actually incredibly insecure. Haman, who looks incredibly secure, he's the second in command to the Persian king, and yet one person refusing to acknowledge him, and he just goes berserk. Why? Because I think there's the truth here. Difficult people are often insecure people because they've built their life on something insecure. Dr. Townsend was doing a talk one day on his book, Boundaries. A guy came up to him and said, "Thank you so much for writing the book, Boundaries. It's changed my life." He said, "What's your favorite part?" He goes, "I have no idea. I didn't read it." "What?" He goes, "Oh, my wife read it." My wife read the book, and I got to tell you, I didn't realize what a crummy communicator I was. And I didn't realize I had some really bad habits in my marriage. But over the last 5 years, as she has used those principles in your book to talk in a respectful way and an honorable way to me, but to set some boundaries about some bad behaviors I had, I've become a much better man. And we have a much closer marriage. And I am so thankful you wrote that book, even though I never read it, because I've been able to experience the benefits of it. Dr. Townsend tells a story about a time in his life that he was starting to build his identity on how many books he sold, how many speaking engagements he had. And he had a dear friend called him to lunch and said, I got to ask you something. I don't recognize you anymore. You seem preoccupied. You don't seem emotionally connected in conversations. You seem very distracted. He goes, "Well, I got a book deal going on, and I got this deadline I got to meet." And he realized that as he reflected on this friend who was calling him on this, that he had really lost his way. And what he realized is that he had taken work from being a good thing to being his ultimate thing, and he had been rooting his identity now in what it meant to have certain sales of books and a certain amount of speaking engagements. He needed a Vashti in his life. He needed a Mordecai in his life. He needed a friend in his life to call him on building his life on something insecure. And he said that friendship redirected me during that season of my life. Second principle. Remember that we are all controlled by something. So if you're not controlled by God, you'll be controlled by your fears, your anxieties, your pleasures, your appetites, your urges, your fears. We're all controlled by something, but it doesn't need to be the difficult people in your life. And it's amazing to me that even in a kingdom where there was really very little freedom, we see little spots of freedom with a guy named Mordecai who decides he's not going to be controlled by this narcissist in his life, despite having no real power. He anchors his identity and his decision-making in something secure, God's commandments in an insecure world. 2 books that are helpful on this I found. One is Crucial Conversations. The writer of this book talks about how our need to be able to have crucial conversations where we speak truth and boundaries and challenge and differences into each other's life is pivotal to being able to have the best kind of marriages, the best kind of relationships in our companies, the best kind of relationship in our family. Yet when we come to these crucial conversations, we've all been taught we have a choice. Either they're going to like me or we're going to tell the truth. I can't do both. And yet what they found in their research was those who are able to have enough trust to work through their difficulties and work through the disagreements increase their relationships. Instead of being controlled by the fear of, I can't really talk about this. There's probably somebody going to be mad at me. Because sometimes it's our need to be liked that keeps us from having crucial conversations. And they found that the time between when you identify a problem and the time at which you address the problem, the shorter that distance, the more trust you have. The longer the distance, the least amount of trust you have. And part of learning to have these kind of crucial conversations means that we're going to not be controlled by the fear or anxiety of these situations. We're going to have to learn how to be the Vashtis and the Esthers and the Mordecais who speak up in a culture that's trying to intimidate, that's trying to control, that's trying to keep us from being people of truth and grace. Third, remember to use wisdom and boundaries when dealing with difficult people. Those books I mentioned already are very helpful. Another one I found helpful is a book called Don't Let the Jerks Get the Best of You. It came out in 1995. Here's what's amazing, and I talk about wisdom and boundaries here, because even Esther, when you watch her eventually stand up before the king and beg for the life of her people, she doesn't do it in an obnoxious way. She speaks incredibly respectful to her husband. I got 2 wives here. Let me find the king. Here he is. She talks incredibly respectful to the king, honorable to the king, if it pleases the king, if I found favor with the king. She even is a master salesman. She has thought through how to give this speech. She positions the speech to the king in a way that sells benefits to him. Had my people only been sold into slavery, I wouldn't even have brought this to your attention, though it would have come at the king's great expense. What's she doing? Listen, I know you don't want to be bothered. And I wouldn't have bothered you except my life's at stake. And even that, I'm not sure would have bothered you that much, except that it would have cost you a lot of money. Masterful ability to wisely choose the right timing for having the conversation, the right tone for having the conversation, the respect and the honor in how she has the conversation. Esther is an amazing, amazing example later on in the book of how a brave heart, trusting in God's security, is able to have a very crucial, very difficult conversation, but she's able to do it with wisdom and with boundaries. And some of us are good at the love grace part, but no truth really gets through, and others are really good at the truth, and like there's carnage everywhere. Only in Christ are we able to simultaneously love difficult people in our life while setting boundaries because we love them in our life. And that's what the Bible offers to us, grace and truth. And the secret is knowing who's really in control of the situation. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your work in this time in history. We ask that you make us and create us and call us to be people of grace and truth. In a world that's compromising on both, Father, may we be the most loving people anyone has ever seen, and may we be people who know what it means to love ourselves, to love others, and to love our God. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. As you head out today, again, I want to encourage you to grab one of our booklets so you can follow along in our study, or you can get into one of our smaller groups. Still, there's sign-ups for that as well. And if you came prepared to give, there's some offering boxes on the way out. Thanks again for being here today.